the vagueness is, I want to say, stolen from me. It is deleted from my life. So that is because all the vagueness of the problems must be removed to exist in a computer, which I guess that's maybe just the way it is. But we also lose something.
Hello, this is Felienne.
And this is Hanna.
And this is another episode of Computer Science, of course.
Computer science.
Of course. Computer science.
Of course.
This is Computer Science.
Of course.
Of course.
Hello, Felienne.
Hey, Hanna.
So, I am very happy because this time you brought a book that I had kind of requested. Tell our listeners, what is it?
And we're going to do a book called Plans and Situated Action by Lucy Suchman.
Excellent. So, who is Lucy?
So she's an ethnographer by study, and she worked at Xerox PARC in the 70s, where all these famous things were invented, like the mouse, and LNK was there. I think a lot of people sort of have some knowledge of what was going on there. And she worked there as an ethnographer, so sort of studying computer people in the wild. And we will, of course, get to that in more detail, but I think one of the most important things she's done is debunk the notion that user interfaces are easy or intuitive and they're self-explanatory. How hard can it be to figure out how something works? And she shows, with techniques coming from ethnography, just observing what people do, sort of without the theory. So it's not an experiment where you bring people in and say, oh, you have to press these buttons. One of the things she did is she put a video camera on a photocopy machine, and she just had people that worked there use the photocopier, and then they couldn't do it. There's a video on YouTube. We will link this in the show notes as well, where you can see people struggle, like, oh, the paper goes in here. Oh, no, this button. Oh, I'm sure it's that button. Like, we've all been in this situation, but then somehow it was very innovative. That's just having a machine with a lot of options didn't really make sure that people would also use all the options.
Oh, I have my office in front of the copy machine, and I'm afraid to say not much seems to have changed in terms of the copy machines. But I'm sure a lot have changed in the field of human-computer interaction because of her work, maybe also in the field of artificial intelligence. We will definitely talk about that, but maybe first a bit more about these key themes in the book.
Yeah, so I think the most important part of the book, this is also in the title, is something called situated action. So how I understand the book, but of course this is always with my computer science background brain, but how I understand it is that people that were doing cognitive science then, and cognitive science in those days must be understood as something very close to AI, close to computer science. It's not so much psychology related as it is now. That people that were studying cognitive science also from the computer perspective thought that if people do something, then what they have is a plan. This is the plan that's in our title, that people have a plan. I must photocopy this 100 times. And then what they do is they go to a machine or they execute their plan in another way, and they simply follow steps in the plan. That was a way of thinking about what people did. And also then that was the idea. She talks about AI a little bit as well. How would we achieve AI? Well, then we just must collect many different plans, and then we put the plans into the computer, and then the computer can pick from a whole menu of different tasks and then say, oh, for this task, this is the plan, execute the plan, and then we are done. And she says, this is a quote from the book, a plan can prescribe action at whatever level of detail one might imagine. And so you might start with a plan that is photocopy this 100 times, and then you go to the machine, and then the plan turns into put one original on the copier, type 100 somewhere, press OK, wait. So the overarching plan turns into a more detailed plan at any level.
Oh, what I like about this is I always felt like everyone else has a plan and I'm just improvising. But now what I hear is everyone is more or less improvising to some degree. So maybe I'm not that weird after all.
Okay. Maybe, yeah.
Let's not make this about me. Yes. Yeah, you described a bit about plans.
Yes. And then
yes.
appends this with something called a situated action. And I really like that she positions this not as something that is opposed of a plan. She's not like, oh, plans don't exist. What actually is the case is situated action. She is much more arguing, well, there's a different view, and sometimes it's a bit of this and a bit of that I already very much like. That is not so much ones and zeros. I think we will get to that later as well. So she says there's a second view of things that people do, which is a situated action. Situated action as such comprises necessarily ad hoc responses to the actions of others and to the contingencies of particular situations. Very much improvising. Rather than depend upon the reliable recognition of intent, successful interaction consists in the collaborative production of intelligibility through mutual access to situational resources and through detection, repair, or exploitation of differences in understanding. And this, I think, is beautiful, that situated action is not just improvising, it is also this, but it's also something that is mutual. That if we are corresponding with each other, or even if you're corresponding with a photocopier, you have to do detection. You have to figure out what is the thing doing, what state is it in. You have to do repair. You make a plan, oh, this doesn't work, and then you come up with a different plan. And sometimes if there is a difference in understanding, you have to do something with that. It also made me think a bit, we can definitely also link to that in the show notes, of the work of your colleague, Mark Dingemans, who's also looked at the repair activities in a conversation. That if you say something, another person might say, huh? And that already does something. I think he calls this a lubricant of conversation. These stop words like, huh? They actually serve a function in a conversation.
Yeah, and now you already compared it a little bit to human interaction. In how far is the interaction we have with machines similar or different from the interaction we have with humans?
So we talked about this before in another episode, if I remember correctly, that if you're in a conversation with two people, then both parties are doing detection and repair and noticing differences. So if I'm speaking to you, even now, if we're video calling, I look at your face and I see you nodding. And if I see you dozing off or looking confused or looking surprised, then I will do something with that. Maybe only in the pace of my voice. And this is, of course, what you do if you're teaching as well. You moderate your pace, you can moderate your pronunciation, trying to sound more clear and more proper English and less Dunglish if people look confused at your accent. So there's all these things you can do. You can ask clarifying questions if you're the confused party. You can also ask, did you understand this? Or is this clear to you? Are you ready to move on? Stuff like this. So it comes from two directions. And I think in any conversation with any machine, this can never be true.
And this is also what Lucy Suchman comments on?
A little bit. So I think she's not so much talking about this two-way street. I think she's very much talking about how do people interact with machines and how do they do this improvisation. So what kind of repair do they do? But she does also talk a bit about AI. So that's more close to maybe that question. And she talks a bit about the Turing test as well, even though she doesn't really say that with so many words. For example, she asks, if one builds a device whose behavior is indistinguishable from that of an intelligent actor, is that device intelligent? She asks. And this, of course, is almost the Turing test in different words. And we have to maybe contextualize this a bit, that she sort of lives in the same universe as Hubert Dreyfus. So she is surrounded by people at that point that are trying to get AI to work. And in the same way of Minsky, the micro world, the expert systems, those type of AI systems are being built all around it.
Okay. I am very curious what the impact was of her work.
Yeah, so I was also curious of this because I had never heard of Lucy Suchman until 3 years ago, maybe. And I learned about her work from a VU colleague that works at the business school. So sort of random, right? Definitely not even in the context of computer science. So I was also wondering, like, how do I not know this work? So I sort of tried to Google this a little bit, and I found an article in MIT Tech Review from the 1990s that was very positive about her work, saying that, which I also think is a good summary. Suchman questioned the computer scientist's assumption that office work was so straightforward and procedural that it could be tailor-made for computerization. In Dutch, we also call IT automation, so to automate something. And then to prove her point, she studied a very procedural group of people doing accounting. This is what she did before the photocopier work. So it's very true here, contrasting what she was doing with the computer science assumption that all work is so easy that it can simply be done by a computer. And then he describes also how her work has been successful, at least in the context of Xerox PARC, that from a lone practitioner, the ethnographic efforts have swollen to about a dozen anthropologists, artificial intelligence experts, and computer scientists trying to create technology based on the nature of real work in the real world. So that is really nice. So at least internally, she had some effect. I am not sure this actually ultimately led to an impact in the practice of programmers. It's also interesting a little bit. Let me do one more quote from the MIT piece before we can go back to a few quotes of Suchman herself, that the piece ends with, already these exotic and seemingly fuzzy pursuits have paid millions in demonstrable benefits. So even though it's very successful, right, you see that he says, well, this has saved millions, but still it must be also called exotic and fuzzy. And I think that's very interesting that the head of Xerox PARC also says somewhere in the piece that, oh, we don't aim to create foundational knowledge. So I think here, even though her work is presented in a very positive way, having a lot of impact, it is also constructed as fuzzy and exotic. I don't think are particularly positive terms. Certainly is not terms you would use for something that is mainstreamed.
I wonder, you say you're not sure if it has affected the practice of developers. I would hope that it has affected my field of HCI to some degree. At least we try to study people in the real world under real circumstances using tools in their lives, and we try to view them as people that react to circumstances in their environment. So in that sense, I would think that much of what we do somehow goes back to her. But then I don't know how much of what we teach students and what we do in theory we actually do in the real world.
Yes, and also sort of where it appears in the computer science curriculum and what the effect of it is. I had a course on user interfaces,
yes,
but I don't think that that course was taught by a professor in databases. So that should be a first context. But I don't think it was done from an ethnographic perspective, in that users were framed as a problem that we have to deal with. And maybe the core difference between the computer view and Suchman's view is that I think still users are framed as problems to be dealt with by programmers. Very often they're also shielded because as a programmer, you don't talk with a user. There's a requirements engineer or a tester that are in between you and people. And Suchman very much views users as sources of knowledge, that we can learn from them. And it's interesting to observe them using our software. That I do think is just a fundamentally different way of looking at the world.
It's a view I very much agree with. Are there a few highlights? Green, yellow, blue, pink?
Yes, 2 greens and 1 dark orange. One thing I think is very interesting, of course, everything we read now, we read through the lens of LLMs, that she talks about how we communicate with computers. And she says that this is increasingly linguistic rather than mechanistic. So this is work from the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And she's already describing that people are using language more and more to communicate with computers. I imagine that she's more talking about newer languages like COBOL or Fortran maybe versus assembly language, something like this. It is not exactly clear what it is that she refers to here. This is sort of assumed knowledge, which is very hard for me to figure out some 50 years later. And she cites work here that's also from the 80s by Hayes and Reddy. She says, the ability to interact gracefully with a computer depends on the number of relatively independent skills. For example, parsing elliptical, fragmented, and otherwise ungrammatical input. So if people make mistakes or you only hear half a sentence, you can still figure this out. And this is to ensure that communication is robust. You also have skills in explaining abilities and limitations, actions, and the motivations behind them. You have to keep track of the focus of attention of a dialogue. Oh, what were we talking about, right? You have to remember, and maybe not just this conversation, but also the one before and before. You have to identify things from descriptions, even if those descriptions are ambiguous or unfalsifiable, and you have to describe things appropriate for the context, right? If I have to explain to someone that isn't Dutch, a very Dutch concept, like a bike lane or the little mini cars that people drive in Amsterdam, then I would do this in a different way than if I would describe it to people that are in the Netherlands. So I think that is very interesting, that if you say, okay, computers are increasingly communicated with language, what is language doing, right? And it's doing all these things. Whereas if you communicate with a computer in a more mechanical way, just like press a button, whether that's a physical button or a button on a website, then you don't really need a lot of these things. And I think this shift is very much also present in LLMs. Now people are saying, oh, well, I might program, quote unquote, an agent with natural language. Okay, but what about of these things are you then exactly doing? So this, yeah, I don't know if this is green or orange or red, and maybe it's purple in that it asks questions of what is language doing. And I think that's very interesting and still also very useful.
Yeah. Does she take a normative stance on if computers should communicate that way?
I think like if you read in between the lines, I do think she thinks this is a positive notion. But she also, now we go to the somewhat darker orange, because that's in my notes I wrote the things that didn't come true. She thinks she's talking about an absolutely hypothetical world. She didn't imagine that it would happen in her lifetime. She's still alive. I saw a keynote of her last year. Like with the work of Dreyfus, they think natural language understanding will sort of never happen. She says, simulation of natural language understanding, even when the language is written rather than spoken, so even easier than we have it now, is proving to be a profoundly difficult problem that is inseparable from the problem of simulating intelligence as such. Sorry, Lucy, but I don't think that's true. You couldn't have known in the 80s. I mean, that's okay. But we are now in a time where we absolutely have a simulation of language and a simulation of understanding at such a high level that some people believe they are talking with knowing beings. I don't think that's intelligence. So maybe language and intelligence were not as closely related as people then thought. He has another quote that's somewhat similar. And here you see the expert systems like way of thinking. She quotes those Hayes and Reddy again. Until a solution is found to the problems of organizing and using the range of world knowledge possessed by a human, practical systems will only be able to comprehend a small amount of input, typically with a very specific domain of expertise. So that is the way of thinking.
Yes.
That in order to do things, you need to have world knowledge, right? This is the Marvin Minsky way of AI, I think, underneath this. That is the perspective that they have on AI.
Okay, we have dark orange, we have green. I'm looking for most beautiful quote.
Okay, I have one. And this is, again, of course, people that have listened to many episodes or read other stuff that I wrote, they know that I'm talking about how do computer science people see the world. And it is so, like, I drink it like a thirsty desert traveler, all these other people that I didn't know about that also so long ago already came to the conclusion that computer science people think in a certain way and other people think in a different way. And this is maybe a problem. This is all the way at the end of the book in the concluding chapter. She says, researchers interested in machine intelligence and human-machine communication have embraced the traditional philosophical and scientific view that purposeful action is planned action, that people think in plans. Yet even casual observation of purposeful action indicates that, as common sense formulations of intent, plans are inherently vague. And then she says, to the cognitive scientist, but again, this must be understood as a computer sciencey person in those days. To this scientist, this vagueness is a fault to be remedied. Insofar as in any event, a plan is the prerequisite for purposeful action, and the details of the action are derivative from the completion and the modification of the plan. And especially, I think, this first part, that vagueness is a fault to be remedied. Right? If something is really vague in the real world, oh no, we can't really deal with this in our computer system, so we just somehow have to turn it into zeros and ones so that our computer can also handle it, rather than this vagueness is just a thing that exists. And that the notion that every time that we put something in the computer, some of the vagueness is lost. And maybe sometimes this is good, but maybe in other cases, the vagueness and also the flexibility that we lose is lost. And I have this one example where we used to do grading of the thesis here at VU on a physical paper. So it was a printed out Word document, and you could circle, it's like a rubric. So you had to say, well, is the candidate level 1, 2, or 3? And you could circle this, but you could also circle it in the middle. The exam board didn't really like this because they're like, oh, this is very vague, but you could do it and you could write in the margins. So there was a lot of freedom that you had. You could scribble, and the richness of feedback that you can give on a thesis is represented in the form that we had, because I could give feedback on things that weren't there. I could skip a line, right? The PDF would error out. If for one category I was like, for this one, I just can't really decide. It's not really there, right? That's also fine. But now, of course, this is replaced by a computer system that is not really even advanced AI. It is just sort of the same form, but now it lives as something like an Excel sheet in the browser. But now the vagueness is, I want to say, stolen from me. It is deleted from my life. The only thing I now can do is I can click the buttons, right? I can't skip, I can't expand. And I think, yes, so that is because all problems, all the vagueness of the problems must be removed to exist in a computer, which I guess that's maybe just the way it is. But we also lose something. And I think that's what she hints at here. So this, I think, is very interesting.
Yeah, I definitely would say that vagueness is the way to have flexibility, to have freedom to color things as we go.
It's from the same page, also all the way at the end. She says, every occasion of human communication is embedded in and makes use of a taken for granted but mutually accessible world. And that I also think is so beautiful, because clearly ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, they can't access the world. Definitely not mutually, right? Not in the same way, yeah. But maybe even at a more abstract level, if we talk about people, like, do we look at the world in the same way? Do we have access to the same facts and the same knowledge? If we want to have human communication, there has to be something that is mutually accessible. And if we lose that, then we lose the ability to have communication, human or otherwise. So
yeah, that was totally like common ground we share.
Yes.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And I think this, like what we talked about with computers as theater, what is an interaction with a computer? What is a conversation? And sort of what's so interesting about this type of work, I think, rather than computer work that just says, oh, here's a problem and we have an algorithm and now the problem is solved, is she's very distant from the work. She doesn't say it's like this or it's like this. She's like, wow, here's a way that you can look at the world. What exactly is a conversation? She gives a lot of food for thought without giving answers, because there are none, right? This vagueness is sort of the point. So it's quite a hard to read book because you have to puzzle so much context together. But otherwise, it is very thoughtful.
And should every computer scientist have read the book?
So it would be nice if every computer scientist would be at the level of history that they could read the book. But I think that is not where we're now. And if you're not ready for this vagueness, then I think it might do more harm than good, right? So for me, the fact that I know like what type of AI were they working on at MIT and how did that influence this thinking, if you don't know these things, then some of it might feel the opposite of thoughtful. It might feel very like, why would you think like this? So it requires a lot of context. And I think this work was sort of a popularized book based on her PhD thesis. So this book was published mid-80s, but the work was already, part of it was done in the 70s because it took a while for the PhD thesis to be turned into a book. I think it's written still a bit as a PhD thesis. So it's written for the in-crowd, which most computer science people are not. So I don't think I would necessarily recommend the whole book. I would recommend the 4-minute YouTube video of people struggling with the photocopier because that's just very funny.
Yeah. And you brought up a few people she cites or she had contact with. So from which disciplines are those people? Like you mentioned the cognitive scientists, of course. You mentioned Dreyfus.
And I think so the people I quoted, Hayes and Reddy, I don't know, to be honest, what they are. They talk about language, so I imagine they are linguists, but they might also be ethnographers. And so as homework, so we can sort of go to homework because then I can talk about more people she worked with or interacted with. There's an exchange of letters in the 90s between Lucy Suchman and Herbert Simon, the Turing Award winner and also Nobel Prize winner in economy, are arguing, I would say, about what is situated action. And then Herb Simon says, well, it's not really something, it's not really defined very well. And then Lucy Suchman patiently tries to explain that what their program is and how a group of people with all diverse views can still have a research program that's somewhat similar. I do think those letters are interesting to read, if only because this is a form of scholarship that we ever read. So this is like a paper, and then there's a reply to the paper, and there's another reply to the other reply. So that way of communicating in public in a written way, it's like a Twitter fight, but then in an academic journal. They're all quite short. It also relies a little bit on the knowledge that we talked about in this episode, but I think that is much shorter and in two ways interesting because the content is interesting, but also it is interesting to see scholars disagreeing in an argumentative way. We don't really have that so much in computer science where people say, well, I think this, and another person say, well, I think the other thing, because most of the disagreements that we have in computer science would be solved by proofs, if possible. Like some people might think P and P are the same thing, and other people might think that's not the same thing, but we're not going to argue about that, right? There's no reason to argue about this because it's either the one way or the other way, and how we would solve this is with a proof, or maybe you can solve this with benchmarking. Oh, I have an algorithm and it's better than your algorithm. Look, I tested it on this data set, and another person might say, well, I tested it on the other data set, right? But to do this in an argumentative fashion, that's just not something we're very much used to. And I thought that was very interesting. So I would want to give this as a homework. And this also shows, of course, the fact that she's picking a fight with, although I think he started it, but she's in a conversation, in a discussion with Herbert Simon. It says something about the influence of her work and her thinking. She does get under his skin. You can see that. And that, of course, speaks for her influence as well, and maybe in a different way than the MIT Technology Review piece.
Awesome. So we read the letters, and then what do we do if we want more output?
Yes. So I think we can do something somewhat similar to the computers as theater homework, where you can reflect on if you're using software. Again, we can think of a software system for getting a refund from the university, or maybe entering grades for a thesis in a computer system. What was your plan? And what were the situated actions? Where were you deviating from your plan? I think that is also a very interesting way, or a useful and constructive way, to look at your interaction with a computer system. You absolutely have a plan, or you might have an objective. You have something you want to do. You want to do something, and then you're like, oh, hey, this button is different. Now what do I do? Just a description of this. I think that would be a fun exercise as a homework exercise. It could be a fun exercise if you teach an HCI course as well. Like, where are you deviating from your plans? And maybe for bonus points, what is your conversation with the user interface?
Yeah. And maybe you will figure out that, like me, you didn't have a plan to begin with. And things just happen in your life.
Of course, you don't always have any plan, right? That's so interesting about Brenda Laurel also picking computer games as an example of an interface. If you play a computer game, certainly you don't have a very detailed plan. Right? You start the game, you might not even know what exactly the game wants of you.
Maybe is there something a developer listening could take away for their practice, like some actionable insights for them in their life?
So observing users, I think, is something that you could do as well if you're in the right context. Where just this experiment, of course, that she did, she just puts a video in a corner and nothing else, and then she analyzes the data. I think it would be very useful, and it's not something I think you normally learn in a computer science program where you make software. And then, of course, nowadays, you don't even have to put a video. You can simply record people's screens if they give permission for this, of course. You can make something and it can exist in the world. And then you can see people struggle. And I think we do this far too little. Analyzing error messages, which is also a way of analyzing the behavior of users. It doesn't happen as much as it could. And I think it would be very useful to understand how are people struggling, not just if the software crashes. That's, of course, something that's usually a log that analyzed, which is good, like we don't want that. But just figuring out how do people use it, simply observing, I think that is very interesting.
Oh, yeah, that reminds me. I looked at the videos, and one thing that's really brilliant about those, and which we don't do enough, I think, is she put people in pairs. So they discuss, and that gives so much insight, because often I see people struggle. I'm like, what's going on in your head? And then you ask them, but then the whole situation is destroyed because somehow they are very much aware of you studying them and so on. But in her setup, they just have these natural conversations that give a, clear insight in what's going on.
Yes, this is actually quite common if you do research with kids, then you do this as well, because it's very hard also to ask kids, like, why did you do this? So putting people in pairs is very useful to not get stuck and to also vocalize why you did something. We did focus groups also as well with kids. So instead of just interviewing one kid, we had like a group of 10 kids, and then we asked the question of all of them. And then, of course, they start conversing with each other, which is, it's hard to note take, but it's also a very natural way to get information. And maybe if I may, one quote to wrap it up that I also like about it again concerns having a conversation. And this is just, it struck close to my heart because I really like breaking rules. This is a quote where Suchman, quotes Irving Goffman. He says, "The whole framework of conversational constraints can become something to honor, to invert, to disregard, depending as the mood strikes." And this, again, in contrast, of course, with LLMs. If you have a conversation with each other, you can do whatever, especially with the two of us I'm thinking of. We both speak English, but also Dutch. So we very casually, if we're not recording a podcast, switch between Dutch and English. And then if I think something fits better in Dutch, I say it in Dutch. Yeah. And then, like, what rule, if any, do I follow if I chat with you? And this, of course, I have with a lot of my friends as well, sometimes with my husband, who is also Dutch. But then there are certain things we just say in English to each other, and we switch between proper Dutch and the local dialect that we both speak. All of these things in conversations, there's so many rich layers that you have access to. Do you speak the language of the streets, or do you speak the language that you speak at home or in school? So many cultures that are bilingual in a certain meaning of the word. All that freedom that is there, that has an expressive power.
I notice it when I go from Netherlands to Germany, and some conventions are different. Like, for example, whom you greet on the street on a walk. And then the reactions, if you do it differently from what people are used to, or talking to the bus driver. I very much like that in the Netherlands you can say thank you to the bus driver. In Germany, we see him as part of the machine. He's part of the bus. Of course, you don't talk to this person. How could you? So if you in Germany thank a bus driver, they are suddenly completely confused. Fun.
It's so weird. If I go on a run, especially if it's early in the morning, you greet other runners. So you just wave your hand or you nod, right? In acknowledgement, like, oh, you're here in the cold rain. Oh, yeah, too. But sometimes I'm on the bike and I see a runner, but I forget that I'm biking and I raise my hand. And then they're entirely confused. They're like, do I know this lady? Why is she waving at me? So just the fact that instead of on the ground, I'm on a bike and I'm, of course, clothed also differently, changes the response, because if someone is running, then it's totally normal. So then coming back to the vagueness and the computer science minds, the fact that is true, and the fact that we can make all sorts of mistakes in grammar and pronunciation and still understand each other, that is a vagueness, I think, that must be nurtured and studied and understood rather than simplified such that it can go in the machine.
Yes. Beautiful ending. Couldn't agree more. Hi, Felienne. It's me, Hanna, with the Lucy Suchman homework. So I must confess that this is one more of these episodes where I did not really do exactly what you asked for the homework, but I came up with my own variation. So because Suchman's videos about the computer scientists trying to use the copy machine are so brilliant and so fascinating, I got curious if I could actually use the copy machine right in front of my office. So the goal I started out with was printing 3 student theses. And the first challenge was, of course, to get these documents from my computer to the printer or to the copy machine. And the university website has an upload tool for this. So I tried to drag and drop the PDFs. But of course, if you drag them just a tiny bit outside of the designated area, then the browser just opens the PDF and leaves this upload website. So there you go, carefully dropping the PDF. So, okay, once I had done this, I went to the printer, but then I have to, of course, tell the printer that it's me, Hanna. And how do you do this? Apparently, you can do this by holding your employee card to the dedicated area at the printer, and then it will know it's you. But I had kind of a bit of a wrong mental model here, because our coffee machines also want to see our employee cards. And what the coffee machines want us to do is to show the barcode on the employee card. So it scans this little barcode and then you get your coffee. But the printer actually doesn't want to see it. So it's based on RFID and it really just wants you to hold it really close and then it will recognize you. So it's kind of confusing when you have a mental model from the coffee machine and you transfer that to the printer. And of course, the printer has no idea that we have coffee machines and that we might transfer our learned interactions from that one machine to another machine. So the printer does not even know that coffee exists. So that's quite a sad existence in a way. But in any case, once I had convinced this machine that it's me, Hanna, I got offered an overview of printing, scanning, and copying, and I chose printing, of course. And there it was, an overview of my 3 documents. I want to print all of them, so I was looking for like a select all option, but that wasn't there, so I started one by one. But once I had selected the first document, suddenly there was a new button saying select all. So it's possible, but a bit later than I had expected. Then the printing was super easy, just pressing the obvious big button. But then there were my copies, and they were actually all black and white. Well, I'm really 100% sure that the default was on color, and I had not changed the default. So I tried again, because I was really convinced. And indeed, if you print a document, it will tell you it will print it in color, but it's actually going to print it in black and white. So I have actually found a bug. Pretty cool. And of course, I cannot accept this. I need to find a workaround. I need to get color printed. So what I tend to do in this kind of situations is I try to place myself in the shoes of the machine. I try to emulate in my head how this machine probably thinks and works. And I also try to put myself in the shoes of the programmer, and I wonder what kind of obvious mistakes could they have made. And so I thought what probably could be the case is some disconnect between the defaults in the front end and the defaults in the back end. So in the back end, maybe the default is black and white, and in the front end, some default is color, and they are not really connected well. So I thought, let's just toggle it from color to black and white and then back to color and see if that helps. And indeed, there you go. To print in color, you need to switch it from color to black to color, and then it works. Poof. But overall, a success story. But I think this would not have worked without placing myself in the shoes of the machine and trying to kind of emulate how the machine thinks and perceives the world and empathizing with the machine and the programmer who programmed the machine. And this idea of placing yourself in someone else's shoes is really, for me, one of the most beautiful parts of the field of human-computer interaction. And of course, if I had simply treated the printer like a human, this entire process had failed completely. And this is also one of the cool topics in Lucy Suchman's book. I actually have found a quote related to this. It's essentially her starting premise. On page 189, she writes, "The project of building interactive machines has more to gain by understanding the differences between human interaction and machine operation than by simply assuming their similarity." So if I apply this to the situation at hand, yes, there's a difference between how humans interact with humans and how humans interact with copy machines, and understanding this difference will help us design better interfaces for copy machines. And apparently there's clearly still a need to do so because our machines are kind of weird. And they're weird not because they're not acting like humans, but they're weird because they're not acting like proper machines. And then maybe as a bonus, I asked myself how some of these interface problems of the copy machines could have been prevented or fixed. And of course, user studies would have been a great thing to do, but I also think many problems could have been prevented by doing what we in HCI call a cognitive walkthrough. So a cognitive walkthrough is a usability inspection method that was invented around 1990 that can be used to find problems in interfaces. And it's based on this theory of how people learn to use new systems. And the core idea is that people approach a new interface with a goal in mind of what they want to achieve, and then they search the interface for actions that might bring them closer to that goal. If they find such an action that looks promising, if they, for example, find a button that seems to bring them closer to their goal, then they choose this option, they do it, they click the button. And then once the machine reacts, they evaluate if they indeed made progress towards their goal. And this cool thing is that researchers turned this theory of how people learn to use new systems into 4 questions. And these 4 questions really can help a programmer or a designer when they design an interface, because you can just ask those 4 questions yourself for each tiny step a user has to take. And asking these questions will allow you to spot problems. So these questions have been reformulated in many ways, but essentially it boils down to asking, first, whether the user at this point will actually try to do the right thing. For example, will they even try to authenticate themselves to the printer? Then, second, whether the user will perceive this action or element that allows them to do so. For instance, will the user see that there's this area at the printer where they can hold their employee card? Or will they not notice this area at all? And then third, if they perceive this, do they understand that this is actually the element they need to use? So maybe they see this area at the printer, but they have no idea what it is for. So then they do not understand that this is the element they need to use. And fourth, once they do what they should do, so once, for example, they hold their employee card to the printer, does the reaction from the machine indicate that they are closer to their goal? Does the user know they made some progress? And whenever a user has to do something, you ask these 4 questions, and as soon as you get a no as an answer, you know you have a problem. And this is really something every programmer can do themselves, or like in the official walkthrough, you can do it with a team of experts. But it's very cheap and easy to do already when you design, and it allows you to find a lot of low-hanging fruit that you can fix before you even start doing the user tests. And something that I find so beautiful about this is that it really ties in with Lucy Suchman's ideas of actions and learning being situated and happening a bit in the heat of the moment and being a bit improvised. So this cognitive walkthrough, like Suchman's book, assumes that users will not read a manual. They will not memorize steps and then execute the steps as described in some manual. Instead, they come up with their actions along the way as they go along in the process. So in this sense, it's very similar what Lucy Suchman writes and how this process works. But on the other hand, this cognitive walkthrough idea is also quite fundamentally different from how Lucy Suchman sees human-computer interaction, because this cognitive walkthrough essentially treats the user as someone who follows clear, predetermined steps over and over again. And that is very much opposite of what Lucy Suchman describes, because she sees no concrete, rigid plan that exists beforehand. So in some way, this cognitive walkthrough is super aligned with Suchman, and in another way, it's very opposite of Suchman. Okay, that got longer than intended. Talk to you soon. Cheers.